მოგესალმებით, ქალბატონებო და ბატონებო, ჩემო ძვირფასო ტელემაყურებლებო. განვაგრძობთ გადაცემათა ციკლს საუბრები ჟურნალისტიკაზე. სიმართლე სიკეთით. დღეს უცხოელი სტუმარი გვყავს გაერთიანებული სამეფოდან, ტექნიკურ მეცნიერებათა დოქტორი, ბაკინგემის უნივერსიტეტის ნანოტექნოლოგიების პროფესორი, 3 პატენტის, 12 მონოგრაფიის, 300-ზე მეტი სამეცნიერო სტატიის ავტორი, 3 სამეცნიერო ჟურნალის, მათ შორის მრავალპროფილიანი ორენოვანი სამეცნიერო კვლევითი ჟურნალ BRAMS-ის სარედაქციო საბჭოს თავმჯდომარე, ჯერემი რამსდენი, ბრიტანეთისა და შვეიცარიის მოქალაქე. 12 წლის განმავლობაში მუშაობდა შვეიცარიაში არსებულ ბაზელის ბიოცენტრში, მოწვეული ლექტორის სტატუსით. საკუთარ სამეცნიერო კვლევით გამოცდილებას უზიარებდა სტუდენტებს არგენტინაში, საფრანგეთში, უნგრეთსა და იაპონიაში. 10 წლეულებია, რაც პროფესორი რამსდენი თანამშრომლობს თბილისელ და ბათუმელ კოლეგებთან და არაერთგზის სტუმრობს ჩვენს ქვეყანას. საქმიანი ვიზიტით. მოგესალმებით, პროფესორ რამსდენ. უღრმესი მადლობა ჩვენს გადაცემაში სტუმრობისა და მონაწილეობისთვის. თქვენ ხშირად წერთ და საუბრობთ უნივერსიტეტებში გატარებული პოსტმოდერნული რეფორმების თაობაზე, რომლის შედეგადაც მნიშვნელოვნად შეიცვალა სამეცნიერო კვლევითი პროცესი და მისგანი დამოკიდებულება. განმარტეთ თუ შეიძლება ამ რეფორმების არსი და მნიშვნელობა. თუნდაც ინგლისის მაგალითზე.
There are two things. One is a specific set of reforms instigated by the Jarrett report to make universities more efficient by infusing them with financial accountability at every level. And the other is the trend from mode 1 to mode 2, or instrumental research. Mode 1 is when the scientists and researchers simply do what they think is most important and interesting. It's a kind of division of labour in society. But mode 2 requires industry, and industry asks universities to carry out defined pieces of research. And the same goes for government. Government departments may ask universities to carry out such research, and also the research councils, government agencies, provide grants to carry out contractually defined pieces of research. Now, the fundamental problem with this mode 2 can be summed up in a single word: prévenance. The French word, which means something like, if I use a Dutch proverb, de klant is koning. The customer is king. And this has some unintended consequences, because it means that the university researcher will tend, sometimes even unconsciously, to provide the answer that who the customer, that is the payer, wants. And it's quite difficult to get around this problem, actually. Now, there are even more unintended consequences, and in the European Union we have also a highly developed system of providing research grants, the so-called Horizon program now, and this goes even beyond the research councils in providing grants. The European Union typically specifies fairly precisely the research area that needs to be done. And of course these programs are written by the bureaucrats in the Commission, and many of them of course were scientists once, they are ex-scientists, but they are not at the cutting edge of research anymore, so they cannot know better than the scientists who are going to carry out the research what is most important and what needs to be done. And there is another inefficiency in all this, simply that there are too many applicants for these grants and research programs now, so that 90% typically of the applications are rejected. They have to be rejected. I have met members of the panels that judge these applicants who are in despair because they are confronted with, let's say, 6 excellent proposals, And because there's only funding for one, they have to reject 5 of them, more or less at random. So the whole system is thoroughly unsatisfactory.
როგორ გესახებათ პრობლემის მოგვარების გზას, სათხებად გამოსავალს ამ პრობლემიდან?
Well, the solution to this problem is actually quite simple. And it is to allocate the resources, adequate resources, which means as much as a scientist can spend, to every scientist. Now, in Great Britain, we have the ambition to become a science superpower. This was, I think, enunciated by Prime Minister last year. And one way of achieving this is to greatly increase spending on science. So the government proposes to spend every year £20,000 million on science. Now, this is going to be allocated to various agencies. For example, there's a brand new agency that's been set up, the ARIA, the Advanced Research and Innovation Agency, and there are numerous other agencies scattered around the country. And of course the research councils will also get some of this money. Now, there are about 10,000 science and engineering professors in the United Kingdom, full professors. And the bar to become such a professor is pretty high. You have to go through not only the rigorous undergraduate and then postgraduate training, research degrees and so on, but then the competition for these posts is pretty intense. And so one can reasonably assume that the occupants of these posts, these chairs of research, are pretty competent scientists who are certainly capable of spending whatever they are given. So my solution is simply to divide this 20,000 million among the 10,000 professors, so they end up with about £2 million each year to spend. And this would enormously increase the output of research, of good research in England. And of course they would be free to collaborate with others. Of course some apparatus and installations cost more than £2 million a year. They would collaborate, they would join other professors, they could pool their resources, and they would be free to spend this money on whatever they like. They could spend it on equipment, they could spend it on studentships, stipends for research students and so on. And they would be free to decide on what topics they will research, because they will know what is best. And we would sweep away all this expensive and demoralizing machinery of research councils and panels and so on that decide on which proposals are going to be funded, which anyway end up being very pedestrian, because by definition the majority of these panels or committees are in the mainstream. And of course the mainstream will always vote against anything that is truly innovative that departs from the mainstream. So you end up with this pedestrian research, and the person receiving the grant feels they have to do what is required, even if they realise that the goals that were written down in the contract are no longer relevant and so on. It's just an awful inefficiency.
წლების წინ თქვენ წერდით იოჰან სებასტიან ბახის სახალხო კანტატაზე უფალო შემისახელებით მარადიულია დიდება შენი, რომლის ტექსტსაც ლოცვა დაღავლენს რეჩიტატივი ბანის პარტიაში, დაგვიფარე ამ წლის განმავლობაში ცეცხლის, სნეულებისა და ომისაგან. მაშინ ბრძანეთ მას შემდეგ, როგორ ჩანს, კაცობრიობა შორს არ წასულა, ან რეგრესმა პროგრესს გაუსწრო. ვინაიდან ეს საფრთხეები კვლავ აქტუალური გეჩვენებოდათ. დღეს როგორ შეაფასებთ ვითარებას ბახის კანტატის მიხედვით?
Well, this is indeed a curious coincidence. Now, I identified contemporary fire with global warming. Disease is COVID-19, but some other things as well, such as the enormous increase in antibiotic-resistant bacteria, And also obesity deserves mention as a terrible scourge, a cause of much ill health, and incidentally global warming as well. So they are related. Now the difference today, compared with Bach's time, seems to be that we imagine that we can do something about them. But what is actually happening does not give enormous ground for optimism. Let's take global warming as an example. Now, going back to question one, we have the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and they are mandated to find not only evidence for global warming, but also evidence for anthropogenic carbon emissions and all the rest of it. And they are not actually honestly giving all the information. Let me quote from Richard Feynman's 1974 Caltech commencement address about scientific integrity, which is a principle of scientific thought that corresponds to a kind of utter honesty. In summary, the idea is to try to give all of the information to help others to judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to judgment in one particular direction or another. And in the case of global warming, this is what the IPCC has singularly failed to do. It's clearly giving information that suits a certain political agenda. And we see this in other fields. We see what has happened in COVID-19, and we see that also in the treatment of other diseases. And when we come to the final in Bach's trilogy, Feuer, Krieg und Pestgefahr, a Krieg, war, we see a horrible proliferation of wars. Now it seems with increasing frequency and severity, and it's almost as if society, or those who are doing their best to lead society, are actually deliberately promoting this proliferation. And of course, all this emphasis on unique agendas deflects attention from providing more sensible solutions. For example, in global warming, we better also consider, at least in parallel, mitigation strategies, because at the moment it doesn't look as though we're going to succeed in cutting emissions sufficiently, anywhere near like sufficiently, to halt the greenhouse effect, if that scenario is indeed correct.
Thank you. ახლა ძალზე აქტუალურია გლობალიზაციის თემა. როგორ შეაფასებთ მის დადებით და უარყოფით მომენტებს, თუნდაც ინგლისის მაგალითზე? Globalization,
well, yes. Now, globalization does seem like a good thing in theory. That global interconnectedness it allows scientists and others, many others, to share, to access ideas and share ideas all over the world. But we can also see some unintended consequences, and the most dangerous that I perceive is the loss of variety. Now, there is a law, a cybernetic law of sufficient variety, of requisite variety, I think, that was formulated by Ross Ashby. And it simply states that in order to deal with the variety of the world, of the variety of problems, the variety of threats to our survival, we need to apply at least as much variety in our solutions. And although globalization might seem to encompass the variety of the whole world, in reality, and this is the unintended consequence, because of the law of exponential advantage, which is sort of more or less amounts to the same thing as the law of preferential attachment, we end up with dramatic loss of variety. Now, the law of exponential advantage really comes from ecology, and it for example, states that if you have various competing species in a niche, that very rapidly anyone that is even only slightly superior will quickly outcompete and eliminate all the others. And we see this with many technologies. We see this with computer operating systems. We see this in business mergers and acquisitions. In Great Britain, for example, we used to have 50 or more aircraft manufacturers. And now, sort of after the post-Second World War in the 1950s, now we have barely one. So you can see wherever you look, you see this terrible concentration. It's well known, for example, on the internet that although there are ever more websites, new websites are constantly being created, but traffic to these websites, is increasingly concentrated on a diminishing number. So that in fact we are constantly suffering from diminishing variety, and this is going to make it very difficult to tackle some of these great problems, because alternative solutions are simply end up being eliminated. Now, it also has political consequences, and this is particularly acute, I feel, for a small country like Georgia, that is at risk of its particular brands of variety being swamped by the big players. Now, the big players, the USA, China, India, and so on, they're not perhaps threatened by globalization, but small players are threatened. Now, we see in the case of Japan, it successfully isolated itself for about 200 years in the 17th and 18th centuries. But even that didn't last, and somehow but at least they showed it was possible. Now it's really very difficult for a country to isolate itself in that way. The pressures are almost incredible. During my visit here, for example, I'm learning about some of the horrible external pressures that are being imposed on the country, and making it difficult for it to carry out what is best for the citizens of the country. And can we generalize it? Perhaps this is somehow related to this question of balance between individualism and collectivism. And I always think of Galileo's remark that one voice of reason is worth more than thousands of voices that parrot the collective wisdom. So we need to keep that very strongly in mind and uphold the value of the individual original contribution.
Thank you. ახლა დიდი დისკუსიები იმართებდა იმის თაობაზე, რომ გუტენბერგის ეპოქის პირშო ბეჭდური მედია გზაჯვარედინსია, რომ მას ციფრულ მედიასთან კონკურენციის უნარი და ძალა არ გააჩნია და შეიძლება ვერ გაუძლოს ამ კონკურენციას, რომ მას გაქრობა ემუქრება. გარკვეულწილად ჟურნალ გაზეთებს კიდეც შეეწყოთ ეს და აკარგეს თითქოს ძველი დიდება. როგორც მკითხველი და რედაქტორ-გამომცემელი, როგორ ხედავთ, მართლაც ემუქრება ბეჭდურ მედიას დამარცხება ამ კონკურენციაში და გაქრობა?
Well, it is a serious problem, and the fundamental issue here is the integrity of inviolability. Now, the printed or written word, whether it's written by hand or printed, makes us a difference actually. Once written, it cannot be undone without leaving traces. And you may remember that famous line from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall call it back to cancel half a line. And in contrast to that, the digital record can be altered with the greatest of ease. So whence comes all our problems of fake news and unreliable evidence and so on, because if it's only stored digitally, we can with great difficulty establish what was originally written down, what was originally recorded in some electronic or optical medium. And there are various corollaries to that, such as when one knows that what is written and cannot be recalled, one takes more care in its preparation. I know myself, if I'm preparing an article for publication in a printed journal, certainly at the final stage of checking the proofs, I try and do it as carefully as possible to ensure the absence of any mistake. Whereas if it's something that's just going to be posted on the website, I know very well that it can be corrected and altered and amended any time I please. And there is, again, we have unintended consequences and corollaries that online journals, particularly online-only journals, tend to be associated with the publishing model, the so-called APC model, the author processing charges. Now, the traditional model of the printed journal uses subscriptions, so the journal is paid for. The scientific journals are mainly subscribed to by libraries and some individuals, and that pays for the costs of production. But with the APC model, the costs are covered by authors who pay a fee to have their article published. It's a bit like the vanity of publishing in the book publishing world. And this brings about an irreparable conflict of interest. This has been pointed out very eloquently by Jeffrey Beall, the distinguished US librarian. And this conflict of interest is simply that the publisher has an interest in publishing as many articles as possible, regardless of quality, because it is on that their income depends. So online APC-style journals are not really peer-reviewed. It goes back in a way to the first question of prévenance. The publisher wants to give the customer, the payer, what he or she wants, whereas the subscribing payer, of course, wants high-quality journals, and the subscriber is not at all connected with the acceptance of papers. Now, some journals have even perhaps honestly you could say, they have accepted this state of affairs and they have no peer review at all, not even a pretensive peer review. They say, well, it is up to the readers to provide comments on these journals, and they provide some online facilities for doing that. Now, that is also a good idea, and actually some of the big publishers, Elsevier, for example, I know perhaps 10 years ago, they tried a system like that. They offered a chance to receive comments on any published paper. But this didn't last very long, and I inquired about the reason for that, and there was simply too little take-up. Too few authors were actually commenting on papers to make it worthwhile. So that is really why we should keep up the at least some printed journals of record, you can call them. Now, there are other issues as well, like the actual reading, and that is really a matter of personal preference, depending on circumstances. It's difficult to read from a computer screen if you're on a sunny beach, for example, but it's also a good compromise that you can have printed journals that are also available digitally. So I don't have to go to a library. In fact, it's many years since I went to a library to take down a journal from a bookshelf and look up a paper. From the convenience of my laptop computer, I can access content from practically any journal in the world. But let us remember that integrity of inviolability that is only possessed by the printed record, not by a digital version.
უღმესი მადლობა საინტერესო პრობლემური თემების განხილვისათვის და ძალიან საინტერესო საუბრისთვის. თქვენ კი მომავალ ხუთშაბათამდე გემშვიდობებით ჩემო ძვირფასო მაყურებლებო.